Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host, and also the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to highlight relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. Today, I'm very happy to be joined once again by Dr. Graeme Codrington, who is an internationally recognized futurist specializing in the future of work. He has helped organizations understand the forces that are going to shape their lives in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And he gives us practical tools to how we're going to respond in order to confidently stay ahead of that change. For the past 2 decades, he's also worked with some of the world's most recognized brands, traveling to over 80 countries in total and speaking to about 100,000 people per year. And not to mention, he's also the author of 5 best-selling books and is on the faculty at 5 of the top global business schools. Thank you, Graeme, for joining me again.
It's lovely to be with you. Thank you.
Wanted to focus this episode with you on lessons for those future-focused leaders, because right now it's so critical for us to be looking ahead and identifying what are those predictors, what are those harbingers that we need to be aware of so that we can stay ahead of the curve or get it at least out in front of it to some extent.
Well, exactly. You know, one of the biggest mistakes that people make is using yesterday's logic for tomorrow's world. And when the world is changing slowly and there's incremental change, whether it's quarter on quarter or year on year, you can keep up. You can catch up. And if you find that your market is shifting, you'll see that shift taking place within the period of your strategic review. So you'll realize that one of your product lines is not selling as well as it used to, or one of your markets is beginning to slow down a little bit. And then you'll wait till the end of your planning cycle, you know, a few months' time, you're going to do your budgets again, and you'll get the manager of that market or that country to come and explain what's going on. And you've got time in order to respond and react. But when you live in a world of disruptive change, when something can come in disrupting you because of the speed at which it arrives, or if it can disrupt you because it fundamentally changes the rules of the game in your industry, you might think you're giving your product to the market at the cheapest price possible. And then a competitor comes in and doesn't just undercut you by a few percentage points. They halve the price or start giving the product away. You know, you can be completely sideswiped. And these days, you don't have 2 or 3 years to sort of go through your standard strategic cycle in order to come up with the answer. So you've got a problem. You've either got to speed up your response cycle, which is what most people are trying to do. And that just causes so much stress and everybody's spinning their wheels like hamsters. Or, and I think this is what we need to be talking about, you've maybe got to adjust how you respond to disruption by becoming more adaptable, more flexible, more responsive to change, which is a different set of skills. It's not just doing what you've always done, but cheaper, faster, and more efficiently. It's approaching the future with a very different mindset.
Well, and that's great. And I like to build off of that, because the wrong mindset to have in this day and age is recognizing that change and disruption is maybe just temporary, or just doing nothing, or looking for a one-size-fits-all solution. So what are some of the characteristics of having the right mindset? What would that entail?
Well, obviously, this is a lot easier to talk about in principle than it is in practice. And we've all got our MBA type case studies of the companies that got it spectacularly wrong. I found a Nokia 3210 in a drawer a little while ago when I was clearing out an old drawer. But it must have been in that drawer at least 12 years. Still had battery life. I mean, Nokia 3210s, one of the greatest phones ever made. And when I bought it and had and you know carried it around, it was my pride purchase. I remember I saw a meme the other day. I'm now stealing somebody else's joke line, but I had a plastic cover. My Nokia 3210 had a protector on it. And this meme just said, does anybody realize that somebody designed a protective cover for the most indestructible phone of all time? And somebody else wrote back, and this was the meme, to say it was to protect the floor when you dropped it. But when I bought that Nokia 3210, Nokia had a 90% plus market share of global phones. And who would have thought that it just wouldn't exist and that we wouldn't be thinking about it? BlackBerry, of course, then came along, and BlackBerry said, no, you want to have a bigger screen, you want to have a proper keyboard, you need more security. And then we were all shifting to BlackBerries. And then, of course, Steve Jobs came along and held up this piece of glass, and people said to him, well, where's the keyboard? And he said, it'll be there when you need it. Poof, mind blown. Surely a keyboard is a binary thing. It's either there or not there. What do you mean it'll be there when I need it, Steve? So we know the story. We know the story of how a massive global company can collapse because the geniuses, most often the founders of the company, didn't keep up with the changing vision in the organization. So, you obviously want to try and learn your lessons from those businesses, but it's an incredibly difficult thing to do because in the moment, those businesses were incredibly successful because of their focus. And so, Charles, it's a really difficult question to answer, which is to say, how do you get that balance between being focused and really good at what you're doing, and at the same time recognizing it could all be taken away from you very quickly by a competitor that's coming in with a very different approach in your environment? But the simplest answer I can give you, which is an attempt at answering it, is I think that those businesses that are absolutely focused on the usage of their products. In other words, what do our customers do with what they buy from us? Not what do they buy from us, and not how much are they prepared to pay us for our products, but what's the actual use of our products? I think if you focus on that, that's a key. Looking at your business from your customer's perspective, not from your capability perspective, is probably the starting point of everything else we're about to talk about.
You're right. And I think a few other things that you mentioned in your book as well with this mindset change that you need to have is you need to question your assumptions. You need to be able to unlearn and relearn things throughout time. You got to know that what got you here is not going to get you there, which is a issue with a lot of companies, like what you said with Nokia that we'll get into in just a few minutes. And then realizing you're never going to have enough information. You're always going to be operating under uncertainty. So if you're waiting for that first step to be taken until you can see the entire path, that's not going to happen. So having that mindset shift is really critical. And then finally, going on the offensive, right? Not reacting, but being more proactive, I think, is another great bit of advice that you've given in regards to having a different mindset when it comes to this.
So let me add to those. All of those are exactly right, but let's try and be practical as well for people who are listening here. I think three things that you could do that would really make a big difference in your business, and you could, and in your team, and you could check yourself right now and think, are we as good as we could be? The first is diversity of inputs. Who are you listening to? And when I say diversity, I'm not just talking culture and gender. Those are the two things we tend to focus on quite a lot when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Those are important, and that's a good starting point. If you don't have enough women in the system, if you don't have enough minority voices in the system, that's as good a place to start as any. But it's more than that. It's look around the group of people who are making the decisions in your team, whether it's the executive team or whether it's a product marketing team or whatever. You could even do a little matrix, put all the people's names, and then put a number of categories of diversity in a sort of Excel spreadsheet, and just see whether there's diversity or sameness in the system. How old are the people in the room? Most executive teams, Charles, you and I work with executive teams all the time. They're all in their late 40s to early 60s, mainly in their 50s. When you're dealing with a particular industry, they've all got a similar educational background, dominated by engineers in certain industries or accountants in other industries. We then have a look at what language is spoken, and then you can go further if you want to. Look at religion and gender orientation and whatever categories of diversity you can imagine. What you're really looking for is differences of worldview, differences of experience. Are you getting those diverse voices in the system? The more diversity you've got in the system, the more likely you are to see things differently and to be able to spot those inflection points as they're coming. So that's the first thing that you can do, diversity. I think the second thing I see companies that don't fall into this trap doing is they have a culture of experimentation. So they have a culture of saying, is there another way? Could we try something? Not a massive business project that could burn the place down if it goes wrong. And that's where a lot of people get a culture of experimentation wrong. They think it's a big business project with a massive investment, and it isn't. We're told to think big. I think no. Think small when it comes to experimentation. You don't want 3 big experiments in the rest of this year. You want 30 between now and Christmas. And if you do the math, that means, yes, more than 1 a week, because it must be small, as minimum risk as possible, as little investment of time and energy, but you're just checking. You're seeing, well, what if we try it this way? What if we try it that way? And it's almost irrelevant what the experiment is, and more important to build that culture of experimentation. And the third thing, which again, we could give people 100 things if they had the whole day with us. Maybe they should sign up for a course, right, Charles? But in the podcast, let me give one more thing here, which I think will make a difference. And that is, do you ask good questions? If you think of the last team meeting you had, are people genuinely asking great questions? Not clarifying questions, not questions of what has to be done by who, by when. Those are just questions to make sure we all get the job done. But actually curiosity-led questions. Are people encouraged to come to the meetings, to come to a management conversation and ask a question that gets us to test our assumptions, that gets us to pause and engage what Daniel Kahneman calls your slow brain, or what Adam Grant calls rethinking and unlearning, to think again. And does your team feel that they have both permission and confidence to question? Sorry, I know I've gone on a bit of a monologue there, but hopefully those 3 things are really useful. Diversity, experimentation, great questions. Those would be 3 really good things you could do to, well, I suppose, future-proof yourself would be what you're doing if you do those 3 things.
No, those are great. And really you clarifying diversity of thought and broadening that definition, because people constrain it to certain parameters, right? I think that's critical, because you want diversity of thought, and that can occur through many different ways. And then with definitely that culture of experimentation, I can speak directly to the company that I'm a part of, that we have experimented extensively throughout this time. Small experiments, like you said, it doesn't have to be something large, requires a lot of resources, but it provides a lot of great information that you can course correct and adapt pretty quickly. And of course, asking great questions. There's a great book by Hal Gregerson. He was on Questions Are the Answer. He also did a lot of work with Clayton Christensen. And he mentions in part of his book that the higher up you go in an organization, it depends more on the questions you can ask and the answers that you have. So critical to have those questions and to be able to ask the right questions during these times of change.
And Charles, just before we move on in the conversation, you just skirted over something there that's really worth highlighting for people. You've said, at IMS, you've been experimenting over the last 2 years. And that's basically because you had the same experience I did in March, April of 2020. Our work just went away. The way in which we worked just disappeared. We had no choice but to experiment. We had no choice but to try new things. I built a green screen studio in my house. I converted an outside room into a new green screen studio, experimented with all sorts of different ways of going virtual. Some worked, some failed spectacularly, but we were forced into it. Like many companies, we're forced into remote working and hybrid environments. And here we are, right? We're in 2022, middle of the year, and we survived. Not all of us have had the best time of our lives over the last 2 years, but we've survived. And in fact, some people have thrived. Some people have said, actually, last year was our best year ever. We were forced into an environment where we were forced to be disrupted and respond to that disruption, and it worked. Wouldn't it be a disaster if we just now tried to ignore all of that disruption and go back to the way that things were? For me, COVID is the most wonderful example and case study of just forcing yourself into the unknown, forcing yourself into disruption, forcing your team to just deal with something immense and get on with it. And I wonder whether leaders need to be a little bit bolder in trusting their teams to really step out and try different things and experiment in ways that they might not have been confident enough to do 2 years ago. But look back at what you've achieved in COVID and give yourself some credit.
That's a great point, because I think COVID hopefully will give them the right mindset to do that, right? To make them bolder in their decisions. The next question really pertains to, and we've kind of spoken about a little bit, is how do you know when a change is a passing fad versus an inflection point that's going to cause something to structurally change in the future? And we talked about Nokia and Apple. You had mentioned it briefly. Nokia was the dominant player in the market prior to that. Apple came out, a computer company came out with an iPhone that everyone thought, well, this is just something that they're going to be doing. It's going to pass quickly. We're going to go back to business as usual. It was a game changer. It was a paradigm shifter. Yeah. How are we better able to identify these inflection points? And if you could just define the inflection point in a simple definition for our listeners as well.
So an inflection point is when the rules of the game change, if that's a useful picture or analogy. People will have probably picked up from my accent that I'm not from the United States. The accent is a South African with a touch of British. And what we call football, soccer, I suppose, was the dominant sport for centuries. We've got thoughts of soccer going all the way back into British history. And then there was a moment in time. It's not quite as fairy tale-ish as the stories are told, but the story is told this way: that at a school called Rugby in the Midlands of England, a guy called Webb Ellis, that's his surname, he just was sick and tired of playing soccer, and he picked up the ball and he ran with it. And nobody else knew what to do. Like, you don't touch the ball in soccer. And he just picked up and he ran with it and he threw it into the goal. And then afterwards, of course, he got into trouble and everything else. And then they said, well, let's make up a game where you can play with your hands. And rugby was born. And so soccer becomes football in an American sense, and rugby and NFL and so on are of a similar kind. The rules change. So in a moment, somebody just decided, I'm not going to play these old rules anymore. And when that happens in your industry, an inflection point happens. That can happen with a product or a service. A competitor comes in and brings a new idea into the business, but it can happen in a variety of ways. It can happen, for example, COVID has brought it in from a recruitment perspective, where people are suddenly realizing, I don't have to live in the same city as my job. And suddenly people are saying, well, I'm going to apply for a job in a different state and I'm not going to move there. If they are prepared to hire me as a remote worker, then everybody's going to be happy. And suddenly we're discovering that that is not just a threat, but also, as always, an opportunity for you to then look for your own future employees in different parts of the world. And that then might change how much you need to pay your employees, or how you reward them. So again, lots of examples now, Charles, about this. The question you asked, so that's what an inflection point is. The rules change. The question you asked is, how would you identify if it is a rules change or if it's just a passing fad, something that comes and then a few years later we look back and we say, well, okay, that was really nothing. It was just a ripple. Very, very quickly, we use a model called the tides of change. Very simple acronym, 5 forces, I think easy to understand. Technology, institutional change, which has really got to do with this issue of the rules of the game, the systems and structures of the organization, the industry, the institution. Demographics, which has got to do with the market segments and the people who are connected to it. Environmental issues and the use of natural resources, and then finally social values. So those are your 5 forces. And what we use is these 5 lenses to look at a force. So you used the example of the smartphone, the Apple iPhone arriving. So is the technology any good? Yes, it's amazing. The institutional structures of communication. We've got to ask our question, does this change the rules of the game? Does it bring communication technology to more people? That's the demographic question. Are more people going to be able to use this? Is it an easier device to use? Is it something that extends from young to old, from rich to poor, and so on? Is it better for the environment? Is a question that's increasingly becoming important in certain industries. And then finally, do people actually want it? And that's your social values. And we often forget that. There's all sorts of things like driverless cars. Everything is in place for driverless cars to come, except that people love driving. Not in traffic, but they love driving their cars. And you know, they can come and get my steering wheel out of my cold, dead hands, you know. I'm not buying a driverless car. So driverless cars, the technology exists, but I think it's going to be delayed in acceptance, whereas smartphones was exactly right for the moment. So that's not enough information for people to use the model in any detailed way. But my answer to your question is there are models that you can use that will help you to determine whether you're dealing with a proper trend or whether it's just a passing fad. And I think this is a theme, it's a different way of thinking about the world around you, rather than simply trying to take what we've always done and improve it for the future.
No, that's great. And I love the tides of change model. I think that's an effective model to use in these cases. It's becoming more aware of the current environment, looking for these, becoming conscious of these, and not just assuming things are going to be the same way as they were in the past. So in the final part, I really want to give leaders some insight into how to be more future focused. You mentioned this a few times. A critical skill to have is being a more adaptive leader. And this adaptive leadership quality has certain characteristics. Is there a way that you could give us some helpful insights into how applying this adaptive intelligence to a leadership environment could be done for leaders at all levels?
Yeah, so adaptive leadership, if it's a capital A and capital L, is an actual model of leadership. Ron Heifetz, a professor at Harvard, is probably the guy who more than others needs to be credited with this. And there's an entire model and system, and if you haven't heard of it before, it's well worth looking up. But if we step back from the formal model, the label is a wonderful label, isn't it? We all understand what it means to be adaptable, adaptive, agile, responsive to change, resilient, flexible. I think all those words are synonyms in how we mean them here. What it really means is that in an environment where the context in which you are living and working and leading is changing, you have to be moving at least the same pace as your environment. And we can go all the way back to Charles Darwin, who talked about the survival of the most adaptable. Most people think he said the survival of the fittest. In fact, he never did. He talked about the survival of the most adaptable. And one of his critics said, the survival of the fittest. And that's an old English word, which doesn't mean the most athletically competent. It means the one that fits the best into its environment, like a puzzle piece fits into the space that's available for it. And when the space is changing, you need to have the fitness for your environment. And when you understand that that's what you're looking for, you're not looking to create a leadership approach which says, I now know how to lead in my environment. I've got education, expertise, experience that's got me to this point of being promoted into leadership, and now I'm going to apply it. In actual fact, you do the opposite. You say, all of my education, experience, expertise builds a foundation on which I can learning new things. And so maybe, Charles, the best description of an adaptive leader is a learning leader, a leader who starts with the mindset of saying, I don't everything that needs to be known. I want to ask great questions. I need to ask different people those questions. There's that diversity again. We're going to need to be experimenting to take us into the future. And personally, I need to open myself up to unlearn, rethink, and then apply what I know to maybe something new and different in the future. At one level, it's all very obvious. When you say it like this, there's very few people are going to say, oh, I disagree. That sounds crazy. Everybody says, yes, that sounds good. But maybe you can ask yourself, if you're listening to this podcast, when last did you admit to yourself that you were wrong? When last have you deliberately admitted to yourself, I need to unlearn this? What I believe about something is incorrect, and I'm now correcting myself. And how did that make you feel? If it made you feel good to say, excellent, I found something that was incorrect in my worldview, and I'm now having the opportunity to correct it. Isn't that wonderful? Well, then you're on your way to being an adaptive leader. If it maybe touched your ego a little bit to admit that you were wrong, then maybe you got some more work to do.
Great insight there. And it really brings back to that right mindset, right? By questioning your assumptions, you need to be very flexible in what you are learning, realize what you don't know, because it's the unknown unknowns that really get a lot of people and a lot of companies in trouble in regards to that. As we near the end of the episode, I always like to ask, is there one thing that you can give leaders to become more future ready that they could implement tomorrow?
So this idea of learning is something that is really worth doing. The last time you had me on the podcast, you asked me for a book recommendation, and I recommended Adam Grant's Think Again. I'd still recommend that. So if you didn't read it after my recommendation last time, do it now. But let me go further. And Catherine Schultz has written a book called On Being Wrong. And so if you want to take yourself one step further, even than Adam Grant goes, Catherine talks about the fact that all learning starts with a level of admission that I've got something wrong. Either it was an empty space, so I didn't know something and now I have to learn it, or it literally was something where I thought one thing and in reality it's something else. And her argument is that we need to get comfortable and confident with being wrong. It's not something that comes naturally to us. Our brains are programmed to want to be right. Our brains are programmed to confirm the things we already believe. This is the single biggest thing we need to unlearn as human beings, because we live at a moment in history where the world is moving too fast for that approach. And so our evolutionary development has to catch up quite quickly with where we are in history to get us to be more comfortable with being wrong in search of becoming right. So we don't accept being wrong, but we're not scared of being wrong. And then we move into finding out, well, what is right and what are the new things that I need to learn. So there's a book recommendation and a suggestion for a skill set to develop.
Wonderful. Thank you, Graeme, for joining me today, and remind listeners how they can get a hold of you.
The easiest way is to just head across to my website. Make sure you get the spelling of my name right. Just have a look at the show notes. Graeme, the Scottish spelling, GraemeCodrington.com, or on any of the social channels, just search for Graeme Codrington and you'll find me. It'd be lovely to have you connected. Let me know you listen to the podcast as well, and we can chat about this on the social channels.
It's been great having you on the podcast again, and this concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, it can be found both on Apple and Spotify. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know that makes a difference, it's what you do consistently.